Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to start the second session. And our first speaker. So what we're doing in this first part of the day is we have the chief investigators of CEPAR giving you a bit of a spiel, right? And the second part of the day, it's more junior people and other aspects of CEPAR. But the first part of the day, we've got another number of chief investigators, the first of whom you've already met because he chaired the first session, Warwick McKibbin.
Thanks very much, John. I learnt the lesson as a chair that if I don't press the start button, I can talk for as long as I like because the timer doesn't start until I press this button. Having said that, I better move on. So this presentation is from the CEPAR stream, and I want to talk about the lessons from the regional modelling team. I'm the head of the ANU node, and this is the research that was undertaken in the ANU node. So what I want to do in this 10 minutes is just talk about what our plan was, what our strategy was, who the team were, what we achieved, what we learnt, and what we're going to do next in terms of continuing the CEPAR research, but outside of the CEPAR overarching brand name. Our goal then was to contribute both theoretically and empirically to the literature on modelling the implications of demographic change, incorporating the links between demographics, COVID-19, which we didn't plan to do, but COVID-19 came along and we were in the right place at the right time. The new work we've just completed on antimicrobial resistance and climate change. Now, obviously all these questions are global questions, and so we're using a global architecture, developing a global architecture to enable us to answer these questions and their interdependence. And so the team that we put together, each had individual research projects, but the idea was to take what we learnt from those projects and embed them in the global framework to help us answer some of these questions, with a particular focus on what was happening in Asia, in particular the demographic transition in Asia, what it meant for the Asian economies, what it meant for the global economy, but in particular what it meant for the Australian economy. So one of the key lessons from this is that the ageing in Australia is important for Australia's economic outcomes, but what's happening globally is actually just as important for the way to think about what will be happening in Australia. So I was the CI. Zhonghua Li is Professor at Korea University, was an associate. Dr. Larry Liu, who is in the audience and will speak last session this afternoon, and a number of students who have all gone off to great things in international institutions, and Hang Hong, who's my last PhD student funded under the CEPAR umbrella. So what we managed to do was we successfully developed this global model. The model itself already existed, the GQ model, very large-scale model of the world economy, but we extended it in very important ways. And we focused on the impacts of infectious diseases. We've done a lot of work on climate shocks, climate policies, climate risk, and antimicrobial resistance. We've had 37 publications, 39 working papers, although some of those working papers were the same paper published in different institutions because we have quite a lot of interest in our work. And we've, particularly the COVID-19 research that I did with Rochelle Fernando, it's been widely cited. So far that paper has had 3,600 citations and actually fed into the policy process. We've got this new project we've started publishing on antimicrobial resistance, and the GQ model is now being used in many central banks around the world, including the Network for Greening the Financial System, for looking at stress testing and climate change. So the four areas I want to summarise what we've learned is demographics, climate change, COVID-19 and AMR. Okay, so the demographic adjustment research looked at the global impacts, but with a focus on Asia. We published papers on Australia in the global context, the importance of international capital flows, and Larry will talk about that a bit more this afternoon, and what it means for financial markets, both within Australia and globally, with these shifting demographics. What we find is when we do the projections, incorporating demographic change into the economies at the economy level has a major impact on what the world looks like in 2050. So this demographic transition has very, very large shifts in the global architecture or the global landscape. We have this big difference between young economies in South Asia and Africa and aging economies in Europe. It turns out that when you do these demographic projections, while you might end up with a lot of economic growth in some of these low-income countries that grow quickly, you don't necessarily improve GDP per capita. So there's a scale effect and there's an individual effect, which is important. What we find is, in terms of financial impacts, and anyone interested in any macroeconomists, we're talking about R*, and this is the focus of central banks. The ageing process in Japan and Europe is likely to pull down R*. The real interest rates will tend to be lower over time, but this will be completely offset by the rapidly growing younger economies who will be demanding more capital and will push up world interest rates. And so it's ambiguous at the global level whether R* will be higher than it is today or lower than it is today. And that's an important issue for central banks in particular. What did we learn about climate change? When we put in physical risks into the analysis, that is, different scenarios about how temperatures may evolve under different emission profiles between now and the end of the century, we find that the economic losses can be really quite significant. And the more that we focus on the economic adjustment to these physical risks, the more things we add, the more we find the costs of not taking action can be quite large. We also find that that's what we call physical risk. There's also a discussion in our research on transition risk. This is, what if government policies start to change? How will it impact different sectors, different countries? We go to a net zero by 2050. What does the world economy look like? It's fairly obvious what we find. We find fossil fuel exporters suffer the most because they're making income from exporting fossil fuels, which they won't be able to do. We also find economies that have a very fossil fuel intensive economic structure, particularly in electricity generation, or who make durable goods that go into investment in these sectors also experience substantial losses. But regions that already start with an abundance of renewable energy, such as Europe and Japan, if you start with that condition, then the costs are a lot less. And so there's this big issue about who's going to pay at the global level. In the end, because of the global problem, international coordination is a really important aspect of the adjustment. COVID-19, we published 5 papers. We actually published the first one before it was a pandemic in January 2020. I happened to be in Washington and Berkeley giving a presentation. We got data out of Wuhan in December 2019, and we did an analysis using the G-cubed of 7 different scenarios. Those 7 different scenarios turned out to be pretty scary, which is why once we got the results, we didn't publish the paper immediately. We plugged into the network we had of central bankers and treasury officials and former PhD students who were in senior positions and said, you've got to take this seriously. You either try and stop it from being a pandemic, or if you don't, you're going to have to respond by some fairly big public health interventions early on. And it turned out when you look through those scenarios, the first paper was a more accurate representation of what ended up happening than the subsequent papers, because we kept updating given information we had, but over time there were different shutdowns and different responses. And the ARC featured this research in a publication on making a difference in research. The reason we were ready to do that was because we already had a program we were setting up to study antimicrobial resistance. Why is this a big issue? Well, it's already a big issue. It's an issue of concern to the UN. And there were 1.27 million deaths already recorded in 2019 from the fact that the viruses are mutating, the antibiotics aren't evolving quickly enough, and so the medical intervention and R&D's not keeping up with the emergence of this antimicrobial resistance. And it's not just a question of public health, it's also a big problem for agriculture. We use microbials in agriculture, industrial applications, healthcare. It's all over the economy, it's all over the world, and you could lose very large productivity benefits in agriculture if in fact you can no longer undertake the practices we currently undertake to increase productivity through microbial interventions. And so we developed that and was ready to go, and then COVID hit. So we basically had the architecture in place. We were able to swap out what we had in the scenarios for AMR and swap in the data from the Wuhan with a few assumptions, very large assumptions. And we find when the initial studies that are just coming out at the Peterson Institute very soon, and is a working paper through CEPAR, is the cumulative GDP losses if we do nothing, we just keep business as usual, between now and 2050 is between $31 trillion and $285 trillion to the world economy, and for Australia around between 297 to 2.9 trillion. So this is a big deal and not much is being done about it. Where do we go from here? What we've done is we've started to work on this project of taking the national transfer accounts that Peter McDonald and team have been working on and embedding them into some of the projections we did, because we had some assumptions about age composition of workforce which weren't country specific, and we want to do it at a country specific level. We want to look at how these more realistic demographic projections and models of economic growth catch up combine to create an emissions profile and a global economic structure profile by 2050. How important are these assumptions? We want to look at what it means for climate policy scenarios once you have a different, or a range of different projections of the world economy. And then we want to we are focusing on a project with the World Bank looking at climate adaptation in Asia and developing some new country models for Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, and Pakistan in that project. So that's it. And I'm not an actuary, but I tried my hardest. That's it.
Are there any questions? We've got time for a couple of questions.
I'm willing to auction off my 5 minutes to another speaker if there's anyone in the room.
No. No? All right. Well, do you want to say anything more?
Well, I was just going to say, there was a lot of material in a short time, and I would suggest you go to the CEPAR website or the CARMA website to see if you're interested. And you can actually download all the papers and the modelling background material from the GCube website as well. So please contact me or go to the websites if you need more information.
So someone was approaching me in the break about work on climate change. So they should go to CARMA for that, yeah?
Beg your pardon?
Someone was approaching me in the break.
Oh, yes. Yes.
Climate change modelling.
So the climate change work we were doing before we joined CEPAR, and we kept doing that work because we discovered in doing the demographic projections that it had a big impact on the inferences about climate change and the structure of the world economy, both the macroeconomic size of countries, but also the sectoral composition of countries, but also the energy structures of economies over time. And so the demographics itself had a very important role to play in improving the work we were already doing, which is why we kept doing the climate work, because we had a demographic climate interaction.
Okay, thank you very much, Warwick. Our next presenter is Alan Woodland. Alan is now an emeritus professor here at UNSW, but had a distinguished career at UBC and then the University of Sydney, and then here at UNSW for 20 years or something, right? Long time, right? And he and I go back a long way in terms of collaboration, so it's a great pleasure to welcome him here. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you. Right. Okay. Now, this project is on demographic change in optimal policy, which is a rather grand thing to be doing optimal policy, but we try to get there a little bit. Our research team is relatively small. We have George Grudner, the research fellow, and we also have associate investigators, Chung Tran, Miguel Oliver Villebril, and Hans Fer from Germany. And we've had on the team in the past PhD students, Daniel Whedon and David Rogers. So one of the focal points of what we've been doing is looking at means-tested age pensions. The means-tested age pension, as we perhaps all know, is eligible to Australians who but are subject to a means test. And the means test is dual. That is, half of it, some of it is based upon the income that you get during the retirement period, and the other is your assets. With this, then the government sets out the structure of it, but individuals have choice about how much work they're going to do, and also about the how many assets they're going to have in their retirement. So today, rather than go through a lot of different papers and so forth and results, I was just going to spend some time on perhaps the first two, depending upon the generosity of the chair. Okay. The first one is really about means testing of the aging populations. So here, that's of course the main thing that we're into, aging populations. And the first project there that I'm going to talk a bit about today has the argument that the age pension means test that I just briefly described a minute ago has an automatic mechanism whereby it helps sustain the budget required to pay for the age pension. The age pension, as I should have mentioned above there, is paid for by the government out of general revenue. So on that, so the idea here is that it does two things. It has the, it encourages pension sustainability and also provides for a more equitable distribution of pension expenditures. So I want to talk a bit more about that in the few minutes that I have. The one that I probably won't get around to is something a bit different, which is temptation and self-control issues. And this is a situation where you have, I guess, a non-standard preferences of consumption over a lifetime, and you have a temptation to spend upfront, and as a result, what people do is work young, while work less when young, and work more when old, and they tend to prefer universal pensions. So there are other papers that we worked on in the past, and one of them was the means testing is, as I'll show you in a minute, there's a little picture of it, is linear, but it can be non-linear, and it's optimal perhaps to have it non-linear rather than the usual linear one. And in a recent paper published by George, along with some others, pensions can have an influence on home ownership. So, they show that the reduced pension generosity increases home ownership significantly, especially for high-skilled individuals. I won't say any more about that, but so the point of this is that the means test and the age pension can be used for all sorts of different things. So let me just talk a little bit about the first of those two things. So at the risk of insulting everyone who knows about the age pension, not everybody has detailed knowledge of the age pension. So if you look at the along here, this has got assessable income, but it could be assets. If you have a very few in the retirement, you get the full pension. And if you have a lot of income or assets, then you get none. And in between, there's a reduction, which we call the taper rate. Here it's called a theta. So that is set by the government, but what's important is that individuals can choose where they want to be on that. And some of our work is to do with the optimal structure of that as well. So what we do in this paper is to look at sustainability and equitable pensions from using the means test. So I'll just outline some of the important aspects of this and then talk about why it works. Okay, so the idea is to look at the means tested age pension as a mechanism that has this sustainability and equitable aspect. So our focal points here are on aging. We have greater longevity, of course, puts pressure on the age pension because there are more older people, and older people retire and get on the age pension. So what we do in this particular study is that we have 4 aging scenarios. We have no, low, medium, and high aging, and those are the dependency ratios are those values there, 0.24 are going up to 0.5. That means the proportion of the population in the 65 plus age group. Okay, the means test, as I just showed you in that picture, it directs pensions to the lower income or lower asset individuals. The taper rates that we consider, the slopes of that function go from 0 all the way up to 1. 0.5 is what we currently have in Australia, so that's our sort of base, if you like. And then there's longevity by skill type. It's important to note that mortality rates and life expectancies differ by classes of households, in particular by their skill level. So we deal here with 5 different categories of skill level, and they will all have different rates of mortality. So not only do you have overall aging, but you have aging at different rates, I suppose, from these different skill types. And what we then do is to have naturally a full model of Australia to analyse this. And I'll just show you some results in a minute. So this mechanism, what am I talking about here? Well, it's aging means more agents are retired. That's the pension costs go up. But also, not only that, and this is important, if you have households, I'll call them agents from time to time, facing higher life expectancy, they will save more. So their decisions to save change. That is, they have higher savings. If you have higher savings, you end up with higher assets or higher asset income, and that means lower pensions. So there's an automatic mechanism whereby the saving behaviour of individuals is changes. So this effect turns out to be higher, the more pronounced are the taper rates. So if the taper rates turned out to be higher, that effect is bigger and bigger. And the other thing is then the gap between life expectancy of the low and high income skill level groups. Because they have different incomes, they will save because they're having higher life expectancies, but the higher skill workers will in fact save more. So this automatic mechanism becomes more effective as population aging increases. So that's an important aspect which I'll try to show you in a few minutes. So as a result of this, then clearly the nature of the pension is important in dealing with population aging, but even with unchanged pension, there is this automatic mechanism at work. Okay, so what we do here to illustrate population aging, so we've got just the low, medium and high aging there, and we're comparing everything to the no aging. So you can see here that going from low to high aging, this is relative to the existing, let's say, no aging scenario and a benchmark taper rate. So you have negatives there, meaning that the labour supply goes down quite a bit with low aging and a lot with high aging. In contrast, the domestic assets, as a result of savings, go up a lot. So that's illustrating my point that the people will, with higher aging, will have higher savings. Pension expenditures, of course, they go up, but they're mitigated by the fact that of this automatic mechanism. Now, the bottom ones, the second bottom one there, I'll draw your attention to, that is the pension ratio for the highest quintile in the skill range to the bottom. So this one goes down and then down a lot with high aging. So that means that it's becoming more equitable as we age there. So that is the situation when you have just aging. So we then go to a slightly different situation where we consider all the different agings. And then if I can draw your attention mainly to the bottom section, in particular, let's look at this one since time is running out. So here we have what happens if you combine the age pension taper rate change with the aging. So here, as we come down here, you can see that pension expenditure goes down relative to what it would be with the pension taper rate of 0.5. And as a result, there's less pension expenditures, and also therefore you need less taxes in order to pay for those. And the pension ratio, whoops. Right. Going backwards, that's, yeah. So this one has gone down a lot, so it's become much more equitable. Now, if you move across all the way here to the high aging one, you can see this compare things in this column. With the high aging, pension expenditure goes down a lot compared to if you didn't change the taper rate. And if you, and then the tax would be corresponding lower, and the pension the equity side here, the ratio of high to low income pension payments has changed quite a lot, which is our point that the effects of these mechanisms have changed, are exaggerated as pensions, as the aging goes up. I think I'll only have time to deal with this one. So what we then did with this is to say, okay, suppose we were to change the pension taper rate with aging, what would happen? And clearly in the top there, all the people who are 80, 60, 40, 20 before, at the time of the reform, most of them are going to have are going to suffer badly if you just suddenly raise the taper rate, except for, so as it turns out, the low skilled people who get the full pension anyway, so the taper rate doesn't affect them. So what we then do is to consider this idea, theoretical idea, an LSRA, the lump sum regulatory authority, to say, well, okay, let's compensate all these people and get them the same level of welfare as they used to have before the reform, and then allocate and then look at the welfare of the next the future generations. And this line that I'm trying to follow here, this orange line, is precisely that. And as you can see, changing the pension taper rate as a result, and then with the aging happening, can in fact be welfare improving. In the second one here, I've simply, we've used a non-lump sum transfers. We use distortionary taxes in order to carry out the compensation to the current generation. And that then means that then the average for the future generations is not as high as up there, but it is nevertheless high. So that means that you get welfare improvement. So the point is that we're connecting here we're connecting the age pension taper rate to the aging of the population. So the main conclusions then, and obviously I'm not going to get on to my next little topic. No, John says no. So population aging induces households to work longer and save more, and this actually helps sustain the age pension in the context of population aging. And as I'm trying to just indicate, the greater the rate of population aging, the more effective this can be. And it also directs pension expenditures to the lower skilled people, so it becomes more equitable as time goes on. So this is all to do with the assumptions about aging, and it also has to do a lot with the response of individuals through their savings and other decisions. And as a result, we need income tax increases less likely. So I won't go on any more there. There are various other projects that are around. The one I just mentioned about home ownership, labour force participation for veterans, joint retirement of couples, so that just gives a flavour, I suppose, of the sort of work we did for the on the means tested age pension, in particular to connect with ageing at this stage. Yeah. Yep. Sorry.
Is there one quick question for Alan? Yeah.
Thank you. I actually have two, but I'll ask both and you can choose one to answer. Alan, it's Marianne Baird from Sydney Uni. Have you thought about modelling the impact of the changes in the superannuation guarantee levy, plus the increasing participation rates of women, with the impact of the age pension over years? So will it reduce the expenditure on the age pension? That's the first question. And the second one, though, you might want to answer is about house ownership, because that's not included in the asset, the primary home. Would that make a big difference if that was included in the assets test?
Well, in our modelling here, we do have superannuation guarantee built in.
Oh, do you?
So all households have the superannuation payments based upon their earnings and so forth. So all of that is taken into account. Not, I'm afraid, the female aspect of it, but yeah, so that aspect is certainly covered.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan.
Okay.
Our next speaker is Jeromey Temple, Professor of Economic Demography at the University of Melbourne. So he's in a team where the CI is actually Peter McDonald, but Peter is unwell and isn't here today. But Jeromey has been Peter's, what should I say?
Sidekick.
Colleague, right? for many years, and yeah, we look forward to hearing from him. Thank you.
Thanks, John. So I'd just like to acknowledge Peter, who through both CEPAR 1 and CEPAR 2 has made a really strong contribution to both CEPAR and to ageing research into Australian demography in particular. But unfortunately, he couldn't be here. This is an overview of our CEPAR team in Melbourne. You can see it's led by Peter. We've had a small team that we think has produced quite a substantial amount of work over a small period of time. At Melbourne, we've worked across 2 of the themes and 3 key projects across demographic projection models, national transfer accounts, which Warwick mentioned earlier, and macro health outcome simulations. Today I want to give an example of how our work on demographic projection models has worked in synergy with our macro health outcome simulations work to show how our demographic work and our health projections work have worked together. And it's one of the benefits of CEPAR. Through the interdisciplinary approach, we've been able to do just more than just demography. So in CEPAR 1, Peter was key in driving the agenda of forecasting and projecting aspects of Australia's population. However, one thing that was missing was looking at subpopulations and how different populations of the Australian population age differently. And we know that through the Aged Care Act and through various government policies, recognition of that diversity is important. There's been, as we've heard already and we'll continue to hear today, there's been a lot of research in the area of individual ageing on how these characteristics are important to the ageing process, whether they're characteristics of the individual or their resources or where they live. However, there's been very little of this from the perspective of population ageing in Australia, and that's something that we sought to address in our work at CEPAR. To date, we've produced a number of different projections which have all been released on the Data Archive, which I'll come back to in a later presentation today. They include the Aboriginal population, various levels of geography, including Australian states, territories and SA3s. We've got a recent paper out on projecting the ageing of the LGBTQ population, new estimates of the oldest old population, projections of dementia, and mature age labour force participation. Even though CEPAR is coming to an end in a month, we've still got a lot coming out. We've done projections on households and living arrangements, our new projections of Aboriginal population, which will be coming out in the next few weeks, subnational projections of the Aboriginal population living with dementia, and very small area level projections of the population living with dementia and the religious affiliation of older Australians. So we've still got quite a bit of work coming out. First example I'd like to give is around this issue of birthplace. So before CEPAR, the latest lot of birthplace projections that had been done in Australia had been done by the AEST in the late 1990s. And these projections were quite out of date and unfortunately didn't include migration in its modelling. So we decided to look at how different birthplace groups aged differently in Australia. Just a quick overview, we know historically that there was a fast growth of the older population in the decade between the mid-90s and the and 2016, and that the overseas born share was increasing. Our projections showed a very significant compositional shift away from a European-dominated birthplace grouping towards an Asian-dominated birthplace grouping in the future. We can see in this example that, in this figure, that also over time what we're seeing is more older people and older people from non-English speaking backgrounds aging into the older old age groups, so aged over 80 into the ages in which use of aged care services becomes more prevalent. And there's very a high range of heterogeneity in the different population ageing pathways between countries. So even when we look into the European countries. We can see there the middle graphs, UK and Ireland at the top, and other European-born at the bottom. And we can see that over time, the UK and Irish-born populations in Australia have continued to grow, albeit still ageing, and that's been driven by continual migration of these population groups over time. However, for some of the other European-born groups, such as those in Italy and Greece, that continued migration wave hasn't continued, and what we can see occurring is a very rapid ageing of that population and then population decline. So those Italians and Greeks that we were used to servicing in aged care won't be there coming up. It'll be the Asian populations that the aged care will be needing to service, which we can see on the right-hand panel, which is the right-hand graphs, which is the Asian-born in the bottom graph and the African and Middle Eastern-born populations above it. The second example of heterogeneity in population ageing that we've done a bit of work around is the ageing of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population. Was commonly thought, inaccurately obviously, that because of differential life expectancy between Aboriginal and non-Indigenous populations, that the Aboriginal population didn't age. Obviously a huge furphy. So we set out to do some modelling around future Aboriginal populations and how they age. We've got a new paper just coming out, a bit of an ad in the next 2 weeks in Genus, which we're looking at multiple different ways of forecasting the Aboriginal population, if anyone's interested. So from this work, what we showed is that the Aboriginal population is indeed ageing, but in a different way to the non-Indigenous population. So you'll see there that so we've used the terminology 45 plus for the cutoff of the older population in the Aboriginal population. That's to capture the fact that Aboriginal people can access aged care services at a younger age in Australia and also have health conditions and comorbid health conditions that occur earlier in the life course. So that cutoff is generally used as a definition of an older population in the Aboriginal population. And we can see across the two graphs that although structural ageing, so the percentage of the Aboriginal population that's over 45, is far more subdued than the non-Indigenous population, the level of numerical ageing, so the increase in the number of older Aboriginal people, is far stronger in the Aboriginal population relative to the non-Indigenous population. We can see this here. The blue graph shows the change in the population, Aboriginal population by mid-century, and the red graph shows the percentage growth rate. So at older age groups, yes, we're starting from a low base, but the population growth in those age ranges is very substantial. You can see in the over 85 group projecting an 800% increase to mid-century. So the demography is interesting, and we do it because we're demographers and we enjoy that. But one thing that CEPAR has allowed us to do is to work with people like Karen Anstey and her team to look at the implications of this demographic change and on other factors. So we started a number of projects looking at projecting the population living with dementia. Prior to this, most of the projections to do with dementia in Australia were produced by AIHW using national level, national population results. So we sought to look at how it might differ in the Aboriginal population and in migrant populations. Using the underlying projection framework, we show that the Aboriginal population living with dementia, we project to forecast by 4.5 to 5.5 fold by 2051, and that was under various different types of scenarios. And for the migrant-born population, because of those differences in demography, even though we account for differences in risk profiles between the birthplace groups, because of the underlying demography, there's a 16 to 400% increase in the populations living with dementia, relative to the birthplace grouping. So our work tried to show that it's not just heterogeneity and individual ageing that needs to be considered. its heterogeneity in population ageing is very important. Not all demographic groups are ageing at the same speed or same rate. And at the same time, it's important to distinguish between structural and numerical ageing. For many of the pension economists around the room, structural ageing is very important because we need to understand the relative tax base to the expenditure requirements of an older population. But when we are planning healthcare services, it's the number of older people who are turning up to seek care that's the key factor. And this then intersects with the provision of culturally appropriate care in Australia and how that changes over time because the different groups are ageing at different speeds. Further research, 2 minutes, okay. So the implications of these changes, as I've said, is it's going to shift how we conceive of culturally appropriate care. How are the needs of special needs communities, the special needs groups identified in the Act, which currently lack access to appropriate care, how can they be serviced by mainstream providers? How some services that may be redundant can transition to caring for other communities. For example, a lot of the aged care providers that are currently servicing the Italian communities, how can that be revisited in the future? And in this dynamic demographic landscape, how can sustainable, culturally appropriate models of care be developed and delivered in the long term? And I just make one final point, is that as I'm the first non-CI to talk, the other CIs have mentioned that they've appreciated the support of a number of junior colleagues, and I'd like to say that I've benefited from the support and encouragement of all the CEPAR CIs, but in particular Peter, John, and Karen, who we've worked together on a number of projects, and I've found it very fruitful. And also with people like Mike, who've brought me onto their grants and helped bring demography into other areas of ageing, and I'm thankful for it.
So we have time for one. I've got a whole range of these, but only some. We have time for one quick question. No? Well, then I'll make up some time. Thank you very much, Jeremy. Our next speaker was to have been Fiona Blyth, who is a CI, but we now have another substitute, and I always have to look, Khaled Bari Sultani, right? So please, you have 10 minutes and then hopefully 5 for questions.
Thank you so much, John, and thanks everyone. Unfortunately, Professor Fiona Blyth was a little bit unwell today, so that's why I'm delivering her talk on behalf of Fiona. So today we want to highlight our research on socioeconomic inequities in health of older adults, implications for population aging. Before I start, I wanted to also acknowledge the traditional owners of the Gadigal land that this program of research took place, and I pay my respect to elders both past and present. So we were a small team, including me, Professor Robert Cumming, Fiona Blyth, and also Associate Investigator, Associate Professor Fiona Stanaway. Despite being a small group, we established a very large network and collaborations with various colleagues at various institutions and universities in Australia, as well as collaboration with colleagues in Europe, mainly Switzerland, UK, and France, and also some collaboration with colleagues in Canada and the US. I will start with a small background to highlight the importance of this program of research. So what is health inequities? Health inequities defined as unnecessary, avoidable, unfair and unjust differences in health among population groups, defined socially, economically, demographically or geographically. Despite many decades of effort in addressing inequities in health, we still see that there is a wide gap between health of different population groups. That is why WHO highlights that identifying health inequities and their drivers is essential for achieving health equity. To refresh your memory about what is socioeconomic position, because this is important and it reflects both resource-based and prestige-based factors that contribute to the position individual or groups hold within the structure of a society. That is why we have various indicators if we want to holistically measure socioeconomic position. And in this framework, we wanted to highlight that there are different indicators at individual level and a structural level referring to socioeconomic position across one's life. And this socioeconomic position gets under the skin through various mechanisms, including psychosocial mechanism and behavioral mechanism, which then explain the biological mechanism that actually shape our health across the life course. And obviously you can see that we put gender, ethnicity, and race because there is intersectionality between these factors and socioeconomic position, which is very important to consider in our research. And I'm not going to explain this slide because we all know that people worldwide are living longer and population aging is a very important demographic shift. And if we want to respond to population aging in a positive and purposeful way, we need to think about inequities as well. So this was the introduction of our program of research and explaining what we are doing and why is that. We want to provide evidence base for policies to move towards equity in healthy aging for all and promoting healthy aging for all. So what we have done during the past 5 years was to focus on mainly occupation, education, and income, and considering theories from life course approaches by thinking about the timing, duration, and sequencing of being exposed to these factors across individuals' life. And we can divide this program of research to 2 themes. One theme was to understand the effect of unhealthy aging, considering the socioeconomic indicators, and the main domains that we considered was pain, falls, and consequences, mortality, and hospitalization. And the second theme was mainly focusing on methodological aspects of health inequity research, because this is an important part if we want to provide precise estimates to avoid underestimation of inequities in healthy aging, and also to highlight the data gaps regarding healthy aging research. And to do this, we used data from longitudinal cohort studies, mainly CHAMP, 45 and up, LSWH, and Path Through Life from Australia, and some other cohorts from other countries. In the next 2 slides, I'm going to very briefly show you a series of research on mortality and socioeconomic conditions, just to highlight that how many ways we can look in addressing one question to understand actually what is happening. So in this figure, you can see that we managed to show that health inequities persist into older ages. And this is very important because there is an assumption that inequities lessen as we age, but actually in reality it accumulates. So if you look at the bottom part of this figure, you can see that there is a dose response inequity based on the cumulative socioeconomic score, which include education, occupation, and income. And we wanted to also understand the role of health-related behavior to understand how health-related behavior contributes to these inequities. And we show that smoking, alcohol consumption, and physical activity can explain up to 22% of inequities in mortality. And this is all-cause mortality, but in the paper we actually looked at cause-specific mortality as well. And further, we wanted to understand how much psychosocial measure actually explain these inequities. And very interestingly, you can see that up to 35% of inequities could be explained by social support, for example, and social satisfaction, as well as depression and anxiety. And further, we wanted to actually understand whether it's accumulation or social mobility. So based on different theories, for example, rising from the rag or falling from the grace, which explain whether someone has a downward or upward social mobility trajectory, or whether it's actually a mobility that explain these inequities. So we considered different theories. We conducted our analysis, and finally, by looking at the stable low result, you can see that it's actually accumulation. So being exposed to adverse socioeconomic condition across the life course plays the most important part comparing to those who had downward trajectories. And we managed to show this by data-driven approaches as well. And just very quickly, we wanted to highlight that apart from mortality, we focused on various outcomes, for example, hospitalization, depression, and falls. And we showed that inequities, no matter the outcome, persist into older ages. And in this start paper, we highlighted that now it's the time to focus on vulnerable population intervention if we want to promote healthy aging for all. And another part of our project were obviously, because Fiona is a pain epidemiologist, we also focus quite a lot on pain and highlighted various aspects of inequities in pain, and also the mediation part of sleep on inequities in pain. And finally, because this decade is a united decade of healthy aging, apart from different domains of healthy aging, we also did quite a lot of research on considering healthy aging as a multidimensional construct. And we started by looking at what is available regarding socioeconomic position and healthy aging as a multidimensional construct. And we highlighted the knowledge gap. And one of the most important knowledge gap was like that people measure healthy aging in different ways. And given the 2015 definition of healthy aging by WHO, everything is more and more complex because we don't know actually how to measure healthy aging. And my talk this afternoon talk about this tool that we provided with the hope of encouraging researchers to use more available data, and I'm gonna talk more this afternoon about this. And finally, I wanted to say thank you to CEPAR to make this project happen. Thank you.
So there's time for just one quick question of someone. I should have said earlier too, Fiona has laryngitis and so is unable to perform today. We have a question over here.
Hi, Simon. Thank you for that presentation. So my question is about those transitions that you talked about, the rags to riches example. Are you able to say that there's evidence that when there is redistributive policies and people are brought up by just sort of transfers of income, that has a positive health effect? Are we able to just say that?
Oh, that's a very good question, Raf. So that's actually the future step of my project, to look at different policies to see whether actually there is an impact at different time points. And I don't think that there is any research that actually looked at it, but I know that colleagues in Switzerland are doing the same to look at this. So very good question. I don't know the answer. Yes.
Okay, so thank you very much. Time we moved on. Our next CI speaker is Sharon Parker. So Sharon comes from Curtin University. She is a WA person. That's right, isn't it? Pretty much. WA.
Yes.
And is very distinguished, and actually just last week she was awarded West Australian Scientist of the Year. Is that the correct title? West Australian? Jointly, right? So we're very pleased about that.
Thank you, John.
Sharon.
Thank you so much. And I'd first like to express my gratitude to the Australian Research Council for generously funding this important work. And the CEPAR team, the professional staff, all of the CIs, all of the researchers, and most especially John, for your leadership. And I'd finally just like to acknowledge the team of people that have been involved in the research that I will share, many from Curtin, but also from elsewhere as well. That's interesting. Okay, so the challenge that we're focusing on in our research is this question of mature workers. And in a nutshell, how do we keep mature workers, older workers, in work longer? Why do we need to think about that? The first reason is that economists in this room assure us that economically it's absolutely vital for people to work longer, and that's because we've got this shrinking work population, but this much larger ageing population who need to be supported. So there are very strong societal benefits here. But there are also individual benefits. So if people work longer, and actually more specifically work in good quality work, it's actually quite protective. And I guess Karen alluded to that earlier in her research, showing that occupational complexity was protective against cognitive decline for men, I think she found. So there's real benefits for individuals too, of keeping them in work, but good work. So we have used this as a framework throughout our research, which is what we call the 3I model of organisational meta strategies. And I know that you've seen it before because we've showed it several times. But in essence, this model comes out of synthesising lots of different theoretical perspectives around what are the ways in which we might think about keeping people at work longer. And I'm going to unpack those and also share a couple of the studies, just a couple within each of those themes. So the first sort of theme is include, and this is the idea that if we want people to stay in work longer, they need to feel welcome in that work, they need to feel that they belong, and they need to be treated fairly and inclusively. And our early MWAS study, and this was a research where we surveyed across the Australian population of workers to understand some of the challenges, identified that there were some issues around inclusion. So, for example, 22% of the sample reported direct experience of age bias, and then if you experienced age bias, you're more likely to be absent. We also found, just as a sort of random example, that nearly 40% of people in that 55 to 64 age bracket were not getting any training to upskill and keep them contemporary. So there's lots of challenges around people having that feeling of being included in work. So the sorts of projects, the sorts of questions that we've been asking are things like, what are these age stereotypes that people might face, and how do they influence whether people stay at work? What can we do to reduce age bias in recruitment? Because it's not only about feeling included when you get into the organisation, it's even getting into the organisation, because we see a lot of exclusion in that recruitment phase. How does quite subtle age discrimination affect engagement and so on? So these are the sorts of questions that we've been asking, and I'll just show you very quickly this one. If you're ageing, you almost certainly can't read what's written down the bottom there, but what this shows is some of the stereotypes, And down the bottom, you see some of the ones that are strongly held against older workers. So I've made them a bit bigger for all of us. So according to, if we ask people what are older workers like, older workers are uncomfortable with new technology, they're stubborn and stuck in their ways, and they rely on rely on outdated knowledge and methods. All of these stereotypes are also associated with negative judgments about work performance. So altogether, you can see some of the reasons why we might see a lack of inclusion in the workplace. The fourth one I didn't write up there, but it's a good one, and that's older people are considered to be wiser. So there is some silver lining in the cloud there. So that's the include component. The second part of our 3I model is individualise. And this really reflects theories and research that shows that, and people have talked about it here today, that people age in the workplace, people age in general in different ways. So, and certainly many people as they age change in terms of physical aspects, they change in things like eyesight and so on, but they also change in terms of preferences and interests and responsibilities in life and so on. So the individualise theme is all about saying, if we want to keep people in work longer, we've got to individualise the work and recognise that people are ageing and that changes what they need, but it also might change differently for different people. But again, from our early MWAS study across Australia, we show that many mature workers are not really feeling this individualised component in their work. So about 63 to 65% of these mature workers are saying there are no alternative career paths, there's no phased retirement programs and so on. And yet we also show at the same time that if you've got these sort of practices, and if you've got good work more generally, then you're much more likely to stay in the workplace. So again, the sort of questions and projects that we have going, trying to understand what sort of balance between challenges and needs keep mature workers engaged. And we show that mature workers like to keep challenged. It's a myth that we want an easier life as we get older. And so on. And you can see, again, lots of different questions there, but I'll just pick up on one of those, and that's this idea that actually not only is it good to have these practices of good work design from the perspective of keeping people in work, but it also could be protective for their cognitive health. And actually this dovetails nicely with Karen, and in fact we're collaborating on some work around this topic. I won't go through the detail here, but one of our papers is a sort of conceptual model where we say, how might good quality work actually protect people cognitively as they age? And so we sort of identify these short-term pathways. If you've got autonomy at work and if you've got challenge, then you're learning all the time. If you extrapolate that across a whole career, then you can see, that might be more, as powerful or even more powerful than, doing Sudoku every day, because you've got that challenge built into your job. We are currently doing a study. This is a study with some honours students where we're testing some of these ideas. So this is a little simulation, and what we do is we've brought older workers into the lab and they have to program this robot to take packages from one side of the warehouse to the other. And what we've already shown in the research is that if you want the older workers to learn to do that most effectively, you've got to give them challenging tasks. So it's not about making it all simple, it's about giving people challenge in work. And the last component is integrate. And this is this idea, and evidence suggests that innovation and good things come from diversity at work. So if we're going to have a lot of age diversity, so multiple generations in the workplace, how do we integrate and make sure that people are sharing knowledge across the generations rather than sort of not speaking to each other and so on? And again, we find from the MWAS study that this is a challenge. So about half of workers over 45 reported little or no access to integrative HR practices that encourage collaboration across different ages. Again, we've been looking at lots of different questions in this space, and I just want to highlight again one finding. And this is a group of 3 studies that we published in one paper, looking at the effect of age diversity in teams on job performance. So 2 of the studies were student samples and the 3rd were military teams. And basically what this graph shows is that you get this positive impact, that's the positive line there, of age diversity on team performance if you've got a group of people that get on really well together and are what's called agreeable, but you get a negative impact of diversity if you've got one person in the group who's really disagreeable and causes conflict, which we think causes a lack of cohesion in the team. So this is an example of the sort of research that we've been doing to understand how do we get the benefits of diversity and not the downsides. I've sort of shown you some ideas across each of those 3 I's, but just very briefly to say, we've also created a measure to assess whether organisations have put in place practices across these 3 I's, and then we show that these practices, if you've got them, they flow through to people being more engaged, the workers being more engaged, less likely to withdraw. That can be psychologically or it can be physically by leaving the organisation, and they're more likely to be proactive still in managing their careers. Just very briefly, some future directions. One of the things we're really looking at now is AI. I showed you already that people perceive that mature workers don't know anything about technology. Of course, in the context of rapidly accelerating AI, that poses some more risks of discrimination. An example of future collaborations, several of us in the team are part of a European network called Leverage, which is 150 researchers from 50 countries working together on these issues. And then finally, one of the things we're doing to have impact is bundling a lot of our findings into a MOOC, so a massive open online course, so that we can make freely available education to leaders across the world as to how to handle some of these 3I components. So thank you so much, and thank you for allowing me to be part of CEPAR.
We've got time for 1 or 2 questions.
Thank you for the presentation. Just a question, you mentioned ageism is the biggest barrier for middle-aged people into employment. So in your view, what measures could be helpful to overcome that perception?
That's a good question. I think part of it, so I guess what we're saying is that a lot of it is about stereotypes. They're not actually accurate, most of them. So, for example, I shared that stereotype that older people are stuck in their ways. Actually, if you look at the evidence using ratings from managers, older people are considered more adaptive, actually, than younger people. So a lot of those things are stereotypes. So they need to be challenged by making sure we get older people into the workplace and properly support them, because then they perform well and it challenges some of those stereotypes. So I would argue that some of those practices that I've talked about, those 3I practices, are a powerful way to combat some of the discrimination and stereotyping. Thank you for the question.
This is so interesting, and thank you for the updates. Economists often look at labor supply with a wage and supply and so on, and like a market, and how about the productivity and the wages? So, for example, my older family members in Germany, they don't want their salaries to go down. They want to keep their high salary, but they also want a bit more flexibility. So they argue correctly. They are very experienced, and why should they accept a wage decrease? But then they want a job that's a bit more flexible and maybe a little bit less stressful. So how does that fit together?
I think that's partly about the individualised component in terms of providing different sorts of models. So unfortunately, COVID, one good outcome of it is it challenges sort of 9 to 5 in the office all the time sort of mindset. But we can go further, and there's all sorts of different models that are emerging, around sometimes people just work for 6 months and then go away and then come back. And so I think part of it is about creating new models that fit and exploring those and recognising that there is an enormous amount of talent wrapped up in those mature workers if they are engaged and want to be involved, I think, and that's what we've got to focus on as well. So I think it's about loosening up some of the ways we do things and creating more of those individualised practices to work to specific needs. Thank you for the question.
So thank you very much,
Thank you,
Sharon.
John.
Yeah. So our last CI is Marion Baird, who joined the second round of CEPAR in 2017. She's Professor of Agenda and Employment Relations in the Business School at the University of Sydney. I seem to recall that 2 or 3 years ago she was named in the top 100 gender specialists globally and is clearly a very distinguished academic in this field. Marion.
Thanks, John, and lovely to see you all. Apologies for the crutch. It's not because of age, I swear. It's not even skiing. I knew people would think that, John. No, I don't. I'll say yoga. So I'm actually not sure. All right, I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are meeting on the lands of the Gadi people of the Eora Nation and pay respects to elders past, present and emerging and any who may be in the room today. And it's really been brilliant as part of CEPAR to see our broadening agenda, and particularly listening to Jeromey, the way in which we've targeted different populations now and understand that the Australian population is much more than just us white European settlers. Today I'd like to briefly talk to you about what we did in CEPAR. As John said, I'm at Sydney University, the Sydney Uni node and part of Stream 3. And we had a focus, as I'll show you, on... Sorry, go back a bit. Oh, I seem to have lost a slide, unfortunately. Okay, our focus in Stream 3 was on promoting effective care outside of work. And we came to study that very closely because of a couple of phenomena that are occurring in the Australian workforce. And for us, context is critical. So the first issue that we are considering and being part of and having to think about the implications of is the ageing of our overall workforce. And in this graph, you can see, perhaps not as clearly, oh yeah, it's pretty good. The red line is 55 to 64-year-olds. So you can see there's been quite a dramatic increase in the proportion of older people in the Australian workforce. So this immediately makes us consider how do we adapt our workplaces, our working practices to this older workforce. The second aspect is this ageing workforce is also feminising. So it's one of the major shifts that have occurred in Australia is the growing proportion of women 50 years and above who are in the Australian workforce. Now, this has had significant implications not only on workplaces and employment policy, but also in the household and the community at large, because they are the people who disproportionately carry the unpaid care roles of looking after our elderly in homes, and those with a disability. And of course, we have older people, grandparents now looking after grandchildren. So we were quite interested in and understanding what is the implication of putting this together, an ageing workforce, but also demands from government for more women to enter the paid workforce, which they are doing, and what does that mean for workplaces. So in our program of research, we undertook 6 large case studies of organisations in Australia in the public sector and the private sector. We worked directly with them over 3 to 4 years, and we produced a number of reports and papers. But in a moment, I'm going to show you what I think is the highlight, and this is the showcase event of our work. We undertook this research through many different methods: policy reviews, surveys, interviews, and interventions. We were a multidisciplinary team and also a multi-age team. We had senior academics, mid-career academics, early career academics, and PhD students. And if I just name them, because we didn't list them on the slide in the writing, Andrea Constantine, Alison Williams, Myra Hamilton, Daniel Denali, Alexandra Heron, Vanessa Lowe, Kate O'Loughlin, and Lisa Gulasarian were all members of our team. Many of them have moved on to other jobs. And in what I'm going to present to you, we undertook a thematic analysis of all our case study organisations based on the literature and drawing on our findings. And we decided, as a group of researchers, the nicest way to bring everything together at the end of CEPAR would be to write a book about our research journey. This book is coming out in November. It's called The Multigenerational Workforce: Managing Age and Gender at Work. And the focus of this book has been to really interrogate those issues that I raised before about the feminising and ageing workforce, but also to locate that within life course theory and to use the concept of the multi-generational workforce, which allows us to move away from simple stereotypes of age and what people do and how they react at work, to combining that with where they are in their life course. Now, immediately, if you think about workers as they are in their life course, you realise that there are different phases of no children, young children, maybe teenagers, older children, grandchildren, and all the other events in life. But the other thing that really comes out quite clearly when you take a life course and multi-generational approach is that you see the differences between males and females' working lives. And that's what we wanted to draw out in our study, as well as the difference between older and younger people as they combine in the workplace. So in this book, and I'm not going through all of these, but you get a sense of the different aspects of the research we undertook and how we combined our different disciplinary backgrounds, which includes organisational behaviour, sociology, and industrial relations and labour economics, to produce these different chapters. And we begin by challenging this notion of age stereotypes and talk more broadly about the multi-generational workforce. And in our discussions with our participating case study organisations, it became clearer and clearer over the last few years that this was the issue they were struggling with, not just how to deal with an older workforce, but how to benefit from exchanges between older and younger workers in the one workplace. We also have a chapter on researching the multi-generational workforce, because working directly with companies with a large-scale program throws up lots of challenges. We wanted to lay them out for future researchers. We then talk about the policy context, how you build age-inclusive workplaces, how you can accommodate care throughout the life course, job design for the multi-generational workforce, intergenerational relationships and knowledge exchange, and finally, which is where most attention has been currently in workplaces, is how do you support retirement pathways or transitions for older workers. So by combining all of that and our survey data and interview data, each chapter seeks to present analysis of those themes, but also draws out practical tips and lessons for workers and managers in these multi-generational workforces. So we hope this book will be one that will be readily picked up and used by the very people that we worked with, and we're grateful for all those organisations for the time and the contributions they made to our research program. Each chapter provides descriptive analyses of the different themes, and I'm just using this particular one as an example, the percentage of workers with care responsibilities by gender and age. And we do that throughout the book. We disaggregate all our data by gender and age. And we also take 4 key indicators of workers' reactions to work, if you like, or in the OB literature, turnover intentions, their desire to leave work or thinking about leaving work, burnout, job satisfaction and work engagement. And we disaggregate that data for each of the themes as well and show the strength of the effect and the degree of the effect. And interestingly, what we find overall, if I can summarise those 10 chapters into sort of one key takeaway, is that where organisations today often get to the point where they suddenly realise they've got a cohort of older workers and they need to introduce a retirement planning seminar for those workers, we found that actually a lot of that attention is completely misdirected. Many of the women want to stay at work longer than the men. They also want to know much more about the career prospects that they have from a much younger age. And in fact, we find that organisations would benefit from investing more in other programs much earlier on in the career cycle of people. So if they invest in intergenerational knowledge programs, well-structured mentoring programs, engagement activities, very well-considered job design practices, things like that, then they would actually have much better outcomes for their organisation, including job satisfaction and work engagement, which we know feeds into productivity. So we argue in all that we would like organisations to move from where many organisations now sit, which is in this bottom right-hand corner. Many of them are now age inclusive, and many are in the top left-hand corner, gender inclusive, because policies have paid a lot of attention to the increasing feminisation of the Australian workforce, but very few organisations have made it to the right-hand top corner to be gender and age inclusive. And throughout the book, we provide the, as I said, suggestions, practices and policies that would enable organisations to move into that top right-hand corner. So I'd like to finish there and thank all our participants. I'd like to thank John and the CEPAR team who've been endlessly helpful. And I'd like to thank all my co-workers at Sydney who have done a terrific job over a long period of time, including COVID, when we were working with these organisations. And of course, that wasn't an easy time to maintain those connections with managers who were struggling to maintain connections with their own workforces. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Marion. There's time for a question or two. Yes.
Recently, there's been quite a bit of attention to the impact of menopause and perimenopause on workforce participation of women. Just wondering, have you been examining that in the research you've been undertaking?
Yes, look, thanks very much for that question, because one of the areas of research that has indirectly, in a way, come out of my research with CEPAR has actually been on that very project, and the follow-on project to this project is called the Body at Work project, which studies the impact of all reproductive processes on men and women in the workplace. So we've been doing a lot of work on that. Okay, this is a bit of a just in this room comment, we did put in an ARC grant to study the impact of those policies on and evaluate them and the impacts on workplaces and productivity, because there is actually no evidence yet to show the actual impact, except for a very small bit from the UK and a little bit in Australia, of menopause and perimenopause on women at work, or the impacts on their productivity. But one of our very critical reviewers said, oh, another midlife crisis that we have to deal with. And so I don't think we scored very highly on the ARC grant. But we are looking at that, and we are doing a lot of work in different areas with companies that are introducing those policies, with unions that are bargaining for them. But ultimately what we really need to do is evaluate how they work in practice and the impacts in the workplace and on those workforces. And if you're interested, I'd be happy to talk over lunch. Thank you.
Yeah, so I guess we should move on. Yep. Thank you very much, Marion. So that brings to an end this morning's session, which covered presentations by all of the chief investigators or their substitutes. I'm about to pass the chair to Hazel Bateman, but I would like just to say that one of the things I have found is that it's just an immense honour to have had the stewardship of a centre with such very distinguished chief investigators. I think, as they demonstrated this morning, they're all just amazing people. So anyway, Hazel.
Okay, thank you, John. I'm just going to make my way to the stage. Okay, so I'm going to be chairing the first half of session 2. Session 2 is research, translation and resources developed. And so the thing about a Centre of Excellence, as opposed to having lots of separate ARC grants, is you get resources to do things that you can't do just with separate grants. So you have an infrastructure to do a lot more than just undertake the research. You can invest in research, translation and dissemination and networking and conferences and a lot of engagement. And so this is what we're going to address in the next session. There'll be 2 speakers in my first part of session 2, and I'd like to call them both to come and sit on the stage now. One is Mark DeCure and the other is Lynn Kelly. And as they come up, I will introduce them. So Mark DeCure has been associated with CEPAR for 20 years. 25 years, okay. Mark has been chair of the CEPAR Advisory Board for the 2 7-year terms of CEPAR, and was also involved in the early days in putting together bids to get a Centre of Excellence funded. Mark is known to many of us because as chairman of the Advisory Board, he's very interactive and he attends many of our events, he asks questions, he's given presentations in Paris, he's done all sorts of things and been a very interactive Advisory Board chair. And Lynn Kelly is a First Assistant Secretary in the Treasury. Treasury is one of the industry partners of CEPAR. So CEPAR is funded by the ARC, by industry partners and also by the universities. And Treasury has been a very important industry partner in both the first round of CEPAR and the second round of CEPAR. And in this position, Lynn is a member of the CEPAR Advisory Board. So we have 2 short presentations. Not sure if we've got time for questions because we'll be bumping onto lunch, but of course there's a lunch session to ask and interact with people. So I'd like to invite Mark first.
Thanks, Hazel. My background is economics, but I'm going to be talking history today because history matters. Today's been a great testament to the world-class research that CEPAR's done, and that's research that's built on CEPAR 1, or the original CEPAR, which obviously also built on what all the academics that came into that did before that. It's been 14 years of fantastic research, and congratulations to everybody. including everyone here today. The success was built by many, but was underpinned by 4 critical factors, in my view. Firstly, excellent researchers, which John's alluded to. Secondly, what I call the leverage, the building of research capability, and everyone has referenced the young, up-and-coming PhD students, early career researchers that have really made a difference, but also they've created capability that will hopefully go on to do greater things. The other thing is it's basically produced some really original research, and today's again testament to that. And I think also finally it's had a very good engagement model, and I say that with a degree of bias because it's sort of been my major focus. So what's engagement about? Engagement is about identifying the intersection of greatest research opportunity by understanding what the end users wants and what the academic capability is. And it's matching those two that's critical. And we've lived in when I first went through uni, I felt that academics sat in one corner and did their research and pumped it out and it went nowhere or somewhere maybe. And end users just sat in the city and complained that the academics never did anything. And so I really had this drive to sort of bring the two together. The other thing that it's done, and this is going to be the topic after lunch, is really the real-time transfer and translation of knowledge from the end research into insight and then action. It's a really important connection so that the academics have great knowledge, but they're also doing research, and it's putting that all into the context of the everyday problem, which has been identified by the end user, that makes magic, and that drives impact. So today I've got 3 messages. You probably caught onto it by now. One is that engagement's played a critical role in CEPAR's outstanding success. 2, research success will come if as much energy is put into engagement as it is into the research itself. Don't shoot me. I think it's true. And thirdly, acknowledge and thank those that have contributed to that engagement process over, for me, it's 23, 24 years, 3 bids, 2 centres, and if I had APAR, we could say 3 centres. And this whole process of engagement didn't come easy. It was something that was hard, both for downtown and for academics. But as I've already alluded to, I think why bother? Well, bother because it makes a big difference. It makes the research relevant, it makes people interested in the research, and it drives impact. And impact's what it's all about. Universities and researchers are increasingly coming under pressure to deliver value. And I'm not saying they haven't in the past, but it's a force that's much more prevalent. And we've seen that with the way research funding has been drying up and people complaining about, how much money the unis get. So we've got to drive our research dollars harder, faster, and get genuine engagement, because that's going to be a game changer. When CEPAR won its first bid in 2010-11, impact was really high on the ARC's list. And they meant research had impact that contributed to the economy, society, culture, national security, policy, services, health, environment, and quality life, with a little kicker at the end, beyond contributions to academia. There was a subtle message there. So in CEPAR's first successful strategic plan, it was a broad it's unsuccessful one. It was broad and fairly bold. It included creating new products, markets, new understandings, improved business practices, policy influence and change, awareness building, community debate, and new learning capacity. The plan said they'd do this by unlocking new insights to help address the challenges of demographic change. They'd build new generation of researchers to provide leverages and careers, and they do it in an interdisciplinary role or collaboration. They would synthesize knowledge and make it more accessible, and they'd engage with society, government and industry to drive social and economic impact. So that was kind of the plan. And today you're probably getting the idea that the plan sort of came together reasonably well. And The other thing we plan to do was set up a repeatable formula, because in strategy you always set up a repeatable formula because that's leverage and that's perpetuity and that increases value. And hopefully we will set up a repeatable formula because it all depends on what happens from here. This is the last CEPAR, but there will be hopefully new generations of organisations and ideas and researchers that will go on to create bigger and better things, much bigger and better than CEPAR's done. And that's the whole idea. That's the repeatable formula. I think one of the things that was mentioned by Frederick this morning, and it was interesting that when I first got involved with the idea of CEPAR, I was approached by the then Dean of the Faculty of Commerce in New South Wales, a guy called Greg Whitred. He was my honours supervisor, and I was the CFO of AMP, and he thought I probably had money and influence. He might have been right. And Greg wanted to support John Piggott, who had this idea of developing some sort of centre into population ageing, and it really just wasn't a thing. It was people would look at you sideways. What do you mean? And to be honest, in our first bid, we faced a bit of that, just grappling with it. But we did a lot of work to try and build a support base and fine-tune the agenda, and we sort of John and I leveraged our friends and mates that were in senior roles and we thought were thought leaders, and it was quite a good group actually. It included CEOs of some of Australia's most powerful companies, the secretaries of a lot of public servant Commonwealth departments, Glenn Stevens from the Reserve Bank. And we went through and just workshopped what were the issues, what really strategically mattered in population ageing, and that then helped form the agenda that was then matched to academics, the best academics in the land. And we followed that. That first time round was probably too broad an agenda. It was hard to manage, and it was a new idea that probably didn't have the full support. But we used that same model the second time round in 2010, and then in 2015. We just pumped it up. We're a little bit more focused, and we're a bit more, we just really built that model up. We even got the Federal Treasurer, Wayne Swan, to launch initially APAR, which then became, was the forerunner to CEPAR. I'm just watching my time. I think I'm still almost okay. We did this through what we called leaders forums, which we got these people together and had these chats, and they were really, really powerful. To have that sort of group together in one room was just amazing to achieve, an effort for the people that organised it. Once CEPAR was established, we established advisory boards, which sort of kept the candle burning. It basically was very senior people, very energised people from partner organisations and interested organisations that basically kept an eye on what the research was going on with, ensured that the knowledge that they could, we couldn't change the research agenda, that was set, but we could sort of fine-tune it a little bit. We could sort of nudge people a little bit, and we could also take the knowledge back to our departments, our organisations, society. And that advisory board exists until today, and Lynn is a member of that, and before her, many esteemed Treasury colleagues have been on it. And it really, I thought, brought to life and gave some energy to the whole process of engaging and keeping that engagement alive. The translation activities were a key plank in this strategy, as I said, and people like Raf and others contributed greatly to research briefs, conferences. There was just a whole range of things there that really helped continue to drive the feedback loop of the knowledge and turning knowledge into insight and turning insight into impact. And, I think that was done. I think that was done well. I sound very Trump when I say that, don't I? But so I'll sort of leave it there because my time's up, but my final thoughts are really just to thank everyone involved in that process. And I'd start with the advisory board, the leaders forums, the stakeholder reference groups that have existed over, 24 odd years, that very senior people that had very little time but gave of it freely to help this cause. And it's just a thing I always was taught. If you want something done, give it to a busy person. The other people I'd like to thank are the researchers, people like John Piggott, the chief investigators, all the researchers that put a lot of work into some of this engagement stuff, which probably could at times seem to be a distraction from the research. Believe me, it wasn't. And the enablers of research, people like Silky, Ralph, Joanna, and all of these people that just did so much behind the scenes to make it all happen. And without them, it's all a waste of time. And finally, thank the ARC for having an impact high on their list of priorities, because it should have been, and I hope that helps justify what we do. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mark. Yes, you can sit down. I may ask you another question. Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you very much for your huge contribution to CEPAR and its success over 20-odd years. Okay, so I'd now like to introduce our next speaker. Our speaker is Lynn Kelly, who's a representative of one of the industry partners of CEPAR, and Lynn is also the Treasury representative on the advisory board. Treasury is, like many places, is a revolving door, and Lynn has been on the advisory board for a couple of years, and most recently in her position as First Assistant Secretary of Retirement Advice and Investment. And so I'd just like to ask Lynn about her reflections of her time associated with CEPAR and what she's gained and what policy in Australia has gained.
Thanks, Hazel. So I thought I would kind of complement Mark's earlier comments with just what we value and why we partner with CEPAR. So Treasury Economic Advisor to Government, and we do it in a number of different policy areas. So up until about 4 weeks ago, I led the retirement advice team in Treasury, so clearly anything retirement have very, very keen interest in. But also, you know, we've got Centre of Population. I can see Yeong there who he's one of the leaders in our tax analysis division. And so he does a lot of he did a lot of the cameo work actually in the retirement income review. We have, as a central agency, we've got the central agency responsibility for things like aged care, for health. The 3 Ps, participation. So the session immediately before reminded me why we seek strategic alliances with great academics, because data and evidence is everything to us, and we invest in it, but we can only do so much internally, so we need strategic partnerships. And CEPAR has been rich for that. For me personally, in terms of policy development, there is so many things that we think are rational policy things to do that don't work, and we don't understand why. And so all the work that CEPAR has done to explain what's actually happening with people, why they make the decisions they make. I think some of the research, for instance, on cognitive decline mapped against financial confidence is very sobering when you're in retirement income policy. But also things like the government has this home equity access scheme, very, very low take-up. And the government scheme is actually really, really concessional relative to the private sector schemes. Still really low take-up. Don't understand why. I've now sat through Hazel's presentation on this twice. Now I understand why. And so it's how for us to actually have policy that lands and delivers on outcomes for Australians needs to be so well-focused, well-delivered, well-explained, and sometimes we fall short. And so this kind of evidence base has been so impactful in reshaping the way that we've done it. We looked at trying to develop a retirement income product some years ago, and it fell flat. I had listened to a very sobering presentation where through CEPAR, it was analysed what people understood and how Treasury had really missed the mark in the way we communicated the product. And so we're currently looking at retirement income phase. Again, we've been out consulting And the lessons learned from those kinds of insights have really been impactful in the way that we not just approach the policy, but we actually explain the policy. The other two things that I probably have really valued from our work is the flexible ways in which we're able to partner with you. So more formal structured kind of learning, the research, but also the roundtables and the dialogues that have happened has been immensely useful for us. I think it has actually really deepened our relationship with academia. Like, I didn't know Hazel until a few years ago, and she's actually ex-Treasury. And so strengthening the relationships, which then means it doesn't just end here, it keeps going on with something else. And then the last thing that I have really valued is not just, you've got some amazing chief investigators, but also seeing the new generation coming through. The amount of kind of, it seems to me, the coaching and mentoring for the next round of chief investigators has been really heartening to see, because it means, I think, we're okay now, but we're going to be okay in the future.
Okay, thank you very much, Lynn. So I'm just going to ask each of you a question and then we can have lunch. So CEPAR may be coming to an end, but we've been training, through the CEPAR 14 years, a lot of people have been trained. A lot of people are now in senior positions, putting teams together, thinking about new grants, new centres of excellence. And so, Mark, if someone's putting together a new centre of excellence, what's one thing they can do to sort of enhance stakeholder engagement in their application? And what's one thing that is really important in terms of building stakeholder engagement?
I'll be a bit controversial. I actually think probably the most important thing is to think about it, sorry Hazel, think about it in the context of a conversation, of a relationship. And I see so many academics, to be honest, they've got a research idea and they come looking for funding. And I think it needs to start as a conversation, exploring, building rapport with people, exploring their needs, and then seeing the intersection, which I alluded to when I was speaking. And I think if you just remember those three things, it was something that was drummed into me as a junior chartered accountant. If I wanted to build my professional career, that's what I needed to do, And it just makes sense. It's just like a relationship, and you've got to think about it that way. And it's easy to build a relationship if you've got one. It's easier for people to, listen to you if you listen to them. So that's my one thing.
Okay. And I guess to Lynn, once we don't have the formal CEPAR relationship, I assume that our relationships are going to keep going. What's one thing that people can do to help continue and build the relationship with the policymakers in Treasury?
So one, keep talking to us, let us know what you're working on, but also just because this one has ended doesn't mean that we're not interested in exploring new opportunities with you. And I know John and I have had a couple of conversations about different possible opportunities, so don't not reach out, don't think we're not interested in continuing to partner. And I know in terms of the success of grants, for instance, having government partners is actually quite impactful. In terms of getting government partners, I think this clear articulation of the value for Australia, for the particular research, how it links to real policy challenges, and what it could look like in terms of tangible insights. So the what's in it for government, if you kind of land that, you'll have a number of quite excited government partners, which I think is quite persuasive at times with grant applications.
Okay, thank you. So I would like to thank both speakers, Mark and Lynn, thank you very much. And we're now going to stop for lunch, and this session will continue after lunch at 1:50. Thank you.